Shabani Nonda is proof of the power of will and determination. Even though he became a famous football star, he always carried with him the memories of a poor childhood in Central Africa. Behind the image of a striker cheered by tens of thousands of fans is the constant worry that everything could disappear at any moment. For many years, Nonda lived with two parallel worlds. One side was the spotlight of professional football, where he was praised as one of the best strikers in Africa. The other side was the memories of a life of deprivation, which always made him strive harder to protect what he had achieved. Every time he stepped onto the field, he not only faced opponents, but also fought against the fear of failure and loss. The biggest turning point came when he was at the peak of his career. Serious knee injuries appeared, and doctors warned that he might never regain his best form. That was a huge shock for a player who was seen as the hope of Monaco and Congolese football. However, instead of giving up, Nonda continued to fight with the strong spirit that had been forged of his years of hardship. Before Didier Drogba became the symbol of African strikers in Europe, Shabani Nonda was once one of the most feared strikers on the old continent. He began to make a name for himself at FC Zurich when he scored 24 goals and won the Swiss League top scorer title in the 1997 to 1998 season. That achievement helped him be voted the best foreign player in the league and opened up opportunities to move to bigger clubs. After a period playing for Rennes, Nonda truly exploded in the AS Monaco shirt. In the 2002 to 2003 season, he scored 26 goals in Ligue 1 and won the French top scorer title. At that time, he was considered one of the most effective strikers in Europe and the pride of African football. In the Congo national team shirt, he scored 20 goals in 36 international matches, becoming one of the greatest strikers in the team's history. Nonda also took part in the journey that took Monaco to the UEFA Champions League final in 2004. After that, he played for AS Roma, Blackburn Rovers, and Galatasaray, where he won the Turkish championship in the 2007 to 2008 season, along with the Turkish Super Cup in 2008. Although he possessed many memorable goals and titles, what makes Shabani Nonda admired is not only his achievements on the field. The greatest value in his story is the ability to stand up after crises that seemed capable of ending his career. He is a symbol of resilience, proving that difficult circumstances cannot determine the fate of those who continue to fight to rise up. Before we explore together the childhood full of poverty and the fears that have followed Shabani Nonda throughout his life, please hit like and leave a heart to honor the man who fought against pains that most of us have never seen. And if you love stories about determination, loss, and the extraordinary rise of sports legends, please subscribe to the channel right now, because Shabani Nonda's journey has only just begun and the most painful chapters are still ahead. Many years before the goals that shook European stadiums, many years before tens of thousands of fans chanted his name under the bright lights of Monaco, Shabani Nonda was just a small boy born in a land where fear seemed to exist in the air. He was born on March 6, 1907 in Bujumbura, Burundi, into a family of Congolese origin, at a time when the Central African region was going through years of instability. That was not a place where children grew up with a sense of safety or innocent dreams. That was a place where adults constantly worried about tomorrow, a place where an economic or political event could change the life of an entire family overnight. When Shabani was still too young to understand everything happening around him, he felt that heavy atmosphere through his parents' eyes. They did not talk much about the difficulties, but the children in the family all understood that life had never been easy. Money was always a problem. Basic needs sometimes became a burden. Every day that passed was a struggle to maintain life and protect the family from the instability covering the region. Other children might grow up with fairy tales before bedtime, but Shabani grew up with conversations about work, about living expenses, and about what could happen if the situation got worse. That is why, from a very early age, he carried within himself a maturity that did not match his age. He learned to observe more than speak, learned to endure more than complain, and learned to accept that life is sometimes unfair. The streets around where he lived not only witnessed the childhood of a boy who loved football, they also witnessed people living in prolonged insecurity. Nonda's family neighbors were also fighting similar difficulties. There were people who worked tirelessly all day, but still could not change their lives. There were families who always had to worry whether tomorrow they would have enough money to continue existing or not. Those images were deeply imprinted in Shabani's mind from when he was very young. It made him understand that no one could guarantee the future. No one could be sure that what they had today would still exist tomorrow. It was those years that created a very special part in his character. When he later became a football star, many people commented that Shabani Nonda was always humble, always quiet, and rarely showed his emotions in public. Few knew that that personality was formed from his insecure childhood. When a child grows up in an environment where everything is fragile, he learns to prepare for losses from a very early age. Even when life later began to get better, that fear never completely disappeared. Deep in his soul, Shabani always felt that good things could leave him at any moment. That is why later, even when he had become one of the best strikers in Europe, he still lived like a person who was always prepared for the next storm coming. But at that time, the boy Shabani knew nothing about Monaco, the Champions League, or big titles. He only knew that his family was fighting every day to survive. And amid those years full of anxiety, a small comfort began to appear. It did not come from money. It did not come from stability. But from an old ball rolling on the empty patches of land in the neighborhood. Shabani could not yet know that what was bringing him joy after each long day would later become the lifebuoy that changed his entire life. But at that time, the boy Shabani did not know that that old ball would later change his entire life. The only thing he knew was that every time he ran after the ball on the dusty, empty patches of land, the worries about poverty seemed to disappear for a moment. In a world where adults always talked about difficulties, about money, and about an uncertain future, football became the only place that brought a sense of freedom. There were no parents' sighs. There were no bills to pay. There was no fear of what tomorrow would be like. There was only the laughter of children and the ball rolling on the rough ground. Those were the rare moments when Shabani was allowed to live true to his childhood. But even that joy did not last completely. As he grew up, he increasingly realized that his family's circumstances were far different from the beautiful dreams that children usually have. Economic difficulties were no longer something vague. They were present in every simple meal, in clothes used for many years, in the days when the family had to think very carefully before spending on anything. While other children still innocently thought about tomorrow's games, Shabani had begun to think about ways to help his family have a better life. That was a burden no one assigned to him, but he voluntarily took it on from a very early age. He understood that his parents had sacrificed so much. He understood that his loved ones deserved a different life, and in the immature thoughts of a boy, football gradually became the only key that could open that door. Yet that belief was not built on favorable conditions. Shabani did not grow up in modern academies. There were no personal coaches. There were no standard training fields. There were no expensive shoes or professional training programs. Many days, he and his friends played ball with balls that were so old they were almost no longer in their original shape. There were torn shoes that had to be used for many months. There were training sessions that were simply running on dusty roads and trying to improve skills with everything they had. But it was precisely in that deprived environment that Shabani's will was forged day by day. Each difficulty made him believe more that he was not allowed to give up. Because if he abandoned football, he would also abandon the opportunity to change his life. While his peers still had time to dream, Shabani learned to take responsibility. he matured faster than other children because circumstances forced him to do so. There were nights lying awake, he thought about the future more than a boy should. He wondered whether his family would ever escape the current difficulties or not, whether life could be better or not, whether there was any other path besides football. And the answer was always the same: no. In Shabani's heart, football was not just a passion. It was hope. It was an escape. It was the only opportunity to break the cycle of poverty that his family had endured for so long. It was that belief that made him train more than others. When his friends rested, he continued to play ball. When his body was tired, he still tried a little more. He did not pursue football because he wanted to be famous. He pursued it because he felt he had no other choice. Many years later, when European stadiums chanted Shabani Nonda's name, very few people knew that behind the beautiful goals were memories of a boy who once saw every ball game on a as an opportunity to save his entire family's future. And it was also during those years that an important decision began to form in his mind. If he wanted to change his fate, he would have to leave the place where he was born. He would have to step out of the familiar world, accept greater risks, and bet everything on the football dream. That was the scariest decision a young man could make. But Shabani understood that sometimes, to live a different life, one must have the courage to leave the current life. Shabani understood that faith alone was not enough. If he wanted to change his fate, he would have to do what many young people in similar situations did not dare to do. He would have to leave his family, leave the place that had nurtured him since childhood, and step into a completely unfamiliar world with no guarantees of success. It was a frightening decision, not because of the geographical distance, but because failure meant that all the hopes he and his family had placed in football would vanish. When the opportunity appeared in Tanzania, Shabani knew he could not refuse. It was not a big contract. It was not a promise of a rich life. It was just a small door opening among thousands of doors that had slammed shut in front of him. But for a young man carrying the desire to escape poverty in his heart, that small door was worth more than anything else. On the day he left his homeland, there were no cheers or congratulations, like people usually imagine about the journey of a future player. There was only his family, eyes full of hope mixed with worry, and a young man trying to appear stronger than he actually felt. In Shabani's heart, excitement always went hand in hand with fear. He knew he was leaving the only safe place he had ever had in his life. He also knew no one could be sure he would succeed. The first days in Tanzania were much more difficult than he had imagined. He missed his family almost every day. He missed the familiar neighborhoods. He missed the voices of his loved ones. He even missed the ordinary things he had once taken for granted. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what loneliness felt like. There were no parents by his side when facing difficulties. There were no relatives to share worries with. There was no one to remind or encourage him when his spirit was down. There were long nights when he could only lie staring at the ceiling and wonder if the decision to leave was a mistake. But every time the thought of giving up appeared, he remembered his family. He remembered the difficulties they were enduring. And he understood that he had no right to fail. Life in Tanzania was not easy at all. Money was always a problem that made him worry. There were periods when everything was lacking. Living conditions were so simple that many people in Europe probably could not imagine. He had to learn to save every small amount. He learned to live with very little in his hands. He learned to accept that there were days when his body was tired, but he still had to continue training, because that was the only path ahead. While many other young players had family support or better foundations, Shabani understood that he was carrying the expectations of his entire family on his shoulders. That created enormous pressure. Football was no longer simply a passion. It became a responsibility. Every training session carried life or death meaning. Every match was an opportunity that could not be missed. He was not allowed to be lazy. He was not allowed to be complacent. And he was certainly not allowed to surrender. There were times when everything seemed too much to bear for a still very young man. But it was precisely in those difficult years that Shabani began to learn the most important skills of life. He learned to take care of himself when there was no family around. He learned to make decisions on his own. He learned to face failure without anyone to comfort him. He learned to stand up after the worst days. Each challenge made him more mature. Each difficulty turned him into a stronger version of himself. Later, when fans saw a cold Shabani Nonda under the pressure of big matches, they did not know that that toughness was not created on European stadiums. It was created from lonely nights in Tanzania, from the days and months he had to face every difficulty life threw at him alone. However, Tanzania was only the first stop. The more he played, the more Shabani understood that if he wanted to truly change his fate, he would have to continue moving even further. An even greater challenge was waiting ahead. It was the journey stepping out of Africa, where he would have to face an entire world that had never known the name Shabani Nonda. But the journey ahead was even more frightening than everything Shabani had ever experienced. Tanzania had taught him how to live far from family. It taught him how to survive amid difficulties. But Europe would test all his remaining limits. When the opportunity from Switzerland appeared, Shabani understood that this was the turning point that could change his entire life. However, just like the day he left his homeland, he stepped onto that journey with more worries than confidence. He carried no guarantees of success. He carried no extra money. He carried no support network strong enough to help him overcome the difficulties ahead. He only carried the desire that had burned for many years and the belief that if he turned back, all previous sacrifices would become meaningless. On the day he set foot in Switzerland, Shabani almost felt like he was stepping into a different world. Everything was unfamiliar. The clean streets, the peaceful cities, the freezing winters, and the pace of life completely different from what he had known in Africa. The climate was the first shock. The cold that pierced through his skin made him feel exhausted many times during the first training sessions. A person who grew up under the African sun now had to adapt to gray skies and temperatures he had never experienced before. But the weather was only the most visible part. The greater difficulty lay in the language. Shabani could hardly communicate like those around him. Conversations in the locker room sometimes sounded like unfamiliar noises he could not fully understand. His teammates' jokes, the coach's detailed instructions, or everyday normal exchanges all became challenges. There were times he felt like an invisible person, present in the crowd but completely out of place. After training sessions, when his teammates returned to their families and friends, Shabani often remained alone with his own thoughts. The loneliness that had followed him in Tanzania now appeared in a different form, even heavier, because this time, the distance between him and his homeland was no longer a few hours of travel, but an entire continent. Calls home became the most precious source of encouragement. Every time he heard his loved ones' voices, he gained more strength to continue. But when the call ended, reality remained unchanged. He was still a young man alone in a foreign country, and the most painful thing was that very few people believed he would succeed. In the eyes of many at that time, Shabani was just a player from Africa, from a region that European football often undervalued. Not a few thought he would quickly disappear. Some saw him as a risky gamble. Skeptical looks appeared everywhere, from the stands to local media, from opponents on the field to people who had never seen him play. It was a familiar feeling. Shabani had been doubted since he was a poor boy. He had been underestimated because of his background. But each time, he chose the only way he knew: stay silent and work harder than everyone else. He trained more, he ran more, he tried harder. When others rested, he continued to perfect himself. When the feeling of loneliness came, he found release on the training field. Football continued to be the only place where he felt he belonged. Then, little by little, everything began to change. Goals appeared. At first, just a few moments that caught people's attention. Then came consecutive matches where he proved his worth. The more he scored, the more Shabani made the doubts weaken. Those who once thought he could not adapt began to look at him differently. Those who once doubted his talent began to mention his name more. And for the first time since leaving Africa, Shabani felt he was truly getting closer to the dream he had pursued for many years. But what no one knew was that every goal not only brought joy, it also brought relief. Because for Shabani, scoring was not simply a football victory. It was proof that his family's sacrifices were not in vain. It was proof that the lonely years in a foreign land were not meaningless. It was proof that the poor boy who once ran after a ball on dusty patches of land still had a chance to change his fate. And as the season continued, all of Switzerland began to know the name Shabani Nonda, a name that not long before almost no one cared about. But this was only the beginning, because the goals at FC Zurich were about to bring him closer to the big stage he had dreamed of since he was a poor child in Central Africa. But what happened at FC Zurich quickly exceeded all expectations Shabani had ever dared to dream of. Just a few years earlier, he was still a lonely young man leaving Africa with a suitcase full of hope and fear. Now he began to become one of the most mentioned names in the Swiss national championship. Each week that passed, his number of goals increased. Each match that passed, his confidence grew. What impressed coaches and fans was not only his goal-scoring ability, but also the way he always appeared at the right moments in the most important times. Shabani did not possess the glamour of a superstar. He did not create sensational headlines in the newspapers, he simply scored goals, time after time. And then the 1997 to 1998 season changed everything. With 24 goals in the Swiss national championship, he became the top scorer of the league. A young man once seen as a stranger now became the #1 striker in the entire league. Those who once doubted began to praise him. Big clubs began to notice him. Scouts from many places in Europe appeared in the stands just to follow this striker from Central Africa. But the interesting thing was that the more successful he became, the more cautious Shabani became. While others saw a star taking off, he still saw the poor boy from back then. While the press wrote about a bright future ahead, he always wondered what would happen if it all ended tomorrow. The childhood years had left in him a too great insecurity. When a person grows up in deprivation, they often do not easily believe in stability. Even when life begins to get better, a part of them is still always preparing for loss. And Shabani was like that. Success did not make him feel invincible. It only made him more afraid of the possibility of losing everything. Nevertheless, his talent had become too obvious to be ignored. In 1998, Rennes of Ligue 1 decided to sign him. That was the biggest step forward in his career up to that point. Ligue 1 at that time was one of the top leagues in Europe, a place with stronger, faster, and much harsher defenders than what he had experienced in Switzerland. But Shabani was no longer the frightened young man when he first set foot in Europe. He had learned how to survive. He had learned how to turn doubt into motivation, and he brought all those lessons to France. The first months at Rennes were not easy at all. The pressure was greater. The competition was fiercer. The media paid more attention. But the more he was challenged, the more Shabani showed his toughness. He continued to score goals. He continued to make the doubters fall silent. And for the first time in his life, he began to feel things that before had only existed in his imagination. Money appeared, no longer having to worry about every small expense. No longer those sleepless nights, fearing not having enough money to survive. His family began to have a better life. Those loved ones who had sacrificed so much for him finally got to enjoy the fruits of those efforts. That was an extremely emotional moment for Shabani, because from the time he was a boy, his biggest goal had never been to become famous. He only wanted his family to no longer have to live in hardship. Now that was gradually becoming reality. Fame also began to arrive. Shabani Nonda's name appeared more and more in sports newspapers. Fans began to recognize him on the streets. Compliments appeared continuously. Experts called him one of the most promising African strikers of his generation. On the outside, everything looked like a perfect fairy tale. A poor boy from Central Africa rising up to become a football star in Europe. But inside that person, the fear had never left. Every time he saw his bank account increase, he remembered the days when he had nothing in his hands. Every time he scored another goal, he reminded himself that success could disappear as quickly as it had appeared. Every time he heard others talk about a bright future, he thought about the worst things that could happen. That was the second life that no one saw. The life of a person who always lived with the feeling that he had to protect what he had earned. That was why, even as he was becoming one of the most prominent strikers in France, Shabani still did not allow himself to relax. He trained as if tomorrow he could lose his place in the lineup. He played as if every match was the last opportunity. And then those excellent performances began to attract attention from a much bigger club. A place that not only promised fame and money, a place that would bring him closer than ever to the peak of European football. That was AS Monaco. And Shabani Nonda was about to enter the most glorious chapter, but also the most painful one in his entire life. And then AS Monaco appeared like a reward for all the years of sacrifice that Shabani Nonda had gone through. When he put pen to paper to sign the contract with the Principality Club in 2000, he felt like he was stepping through a completely new door in his life. This was no longer the fight for survival like the days in Tanzania. It was no longer the journey to prove himself, like the early time in Switzerland. It was no longer the effort to be recognized like when he first arrived in France. For the first time in his life, Shabani felt he had truly arrived. Monaco at that time was one of the most ambitious clubs in Europe. They had quality players, a top professional environment, and great goals. For a boy who had grown up amid poverty in Central Africa, wearing the red and white shirt of Monaco was like an unimaginable dream. He remembered the days running barefoot on dusty fields, the nights lying listening to his family worry about the future, and the months and years living in deprivation. Now, all of that seemed to be left behind. Life changed so quickly that sometimes even he could not believe it. Luxury hotels, modern stadiums, flights across Europe, and income levels he had never dared to imagine before. His family no longer had to worry about money. The loved ones who had endured hardships for many years finally got to live better. That was what made Shabani happier than any goal, because deep in his heart he had never forgotten the reason he started playing football. He did not play to become famous. He played to change his family's life. And now, that had become reality. But Shabani's success at Monaco was not only in money or fame. What was more important was that he quickly became the center of the team's plans. Fans saw in him a new leader in attack. The coaching staff saw a striker who could decide the fate of a match with just one moment. Teammates trusted him in the most difficult times. Every time he stepped onto the Louis II field, he felt the love from the stands. Cheers rang out every time he touched the ball. Flags bearing his name appeared more and more. A boy who once felt invisible in the vast world now became the hope of tens of thousands of people. That was an extremely special feeling. The first seasons at Monaco were the happiest time in Shabani's life. He scored goals continuously. He played with a confidence he had never had before. Each week that passed felt like an affirmation that all previous sacrifices were worth it. The lonely years in Tanzania, the days of being doubted in Switzerland, the difficulties when first setting foot in Europe, all of it seemed to have been rewarded. With each goal, Shabani believed more that he had defeated fate. He was no longer the boy living in fear of poverty. He was no longer the young man who had to worry about the future every day. He had become a true star of European football. And perhaps, for the first time since he was a poor boy living amid the instability of Central Africa, he allowed himself to believe that life was finally smiling at him. Those around him also sensed that. Shabani began to open up more confident. Smiles appeared more on his face. He no longer carried the constant tension like in the early years of his career. Success gave him the sense of security he had sought his entire life. Every time he called home, he could tell his family that everything was okay, that the difficult days had passed, that the future had finally become bright, and perhaps that was what made what happened later so painful. Because at that time, Shabani truly believed that the biggest battle of his life had ended. He believed that the sufferings of his childhood were left behind. He believed that the years of insecurity belonged to the past. He believed that life had finally allowed him to enjoy the fruits after so many losses. But sometimes fate is cruelest when people begin to feel safe. When Shabani entered the most brilliant years in the Monaco shirt, he had no idea that he was approaching the peak of his career. And he also had no idea that right on the other side of that mountain peak, a crisis was quietly waiting. A crisis powerful enough to change the entire rest of his life. And then the season that Shabani Nonda had waited for his entire life finally arrived. After the years of wandering from Central Africa to Tanzania, from Switzerland to France, all the experience, all the sacrifices, and all the pain seemed to converge to create the most perfect version of him. In the AS Monaco shirt, Shabani was no longer simply a good striker. He began to become a real nightmare for defensive lines across France. Every time the ball appeared in the penalty area, defenders knew that just one moment of carelessness was enough to pay the price. He possessed speed, strength, positioning ability, and especially a rare goal-scoring instinct. Those qualities had existed for a long time, but now they were brought to full play in the most ideal environment. The 2002 to 2003 season became the most glorious chapter in Shabani Nonda's career. Week after week, he scored continuously. Ligue 1 stadiums began to get used to the sight of Shabani running toward the stands to celebrate after important strikes. Not only did he score many goals, he also scored in the biggest matches, the most important moments, and against the strongest opponents. When the season ended, the statistics made all of France take notice. 26 goals, the Ligue 1 top scorer title, an achievement that very few foreign strikers could achieve. To Monaco fans, he was the new hero. To French football, he was one of the most feared strikers in the league. But to Shabani, it was also proof that the poor boy from back then had truly accomplished what seemed impossible. Compliments began to appear across Europe. French media praised him as the modern center-forward model. Football experts rated him among the most effective strikers on the old continent. Big clubs began to follow his every step. There were articles mentioning Shabani Nonda's name alongside the most famous strikers of that time. What many years earlier no one could have imagined was now happening before their eyes. From an unknown player from Africa, he had become a name known throughout Europe. The goals not only changed his life, they also changed the way the world viewed Congolese football. For many years, African football was often undervalued in major European leagues, but Shabani was proving the opposite. He became the pride of millions of Congolese people. Children in Kinshasa, Lubumbashi, and many other cities began to mention his name as a symbol of hope. African newspapers continuously reported on his successes at Monaco. For many poor families across the continent, Shabani's story was like a miracle. It proved that origin does not determine fate. It proved that a boy who grew up in deprivation could still stand alongside the biggest stars in the world if he was persistent enough. Every time he returned to wear the Congo national team shirt, he felt the special love from the fans. They did not just see a goal-scoring striker, they saw themselves in his story, a person who had stepped out from familiar difficulties that they understood better than anyone. And the more successful he became, the closer Shabani got to the peaks he had only dared to dream of before. The Champions League was no longer a television program to watch from afar. It became a stage where he got to participate directly. Matches against Europe's top teams were no longer distant. They became reality. He began to believe he could reach the highest level of world football. He could compete with the best strikers on the planet. He could win the biggest titles that a professional player always dreamed of. That was the period when everything seemed perfect. Career soaring, family stable, fame spreading. Money was no longer a worry. Fans loved him, teammates trusted him, coaches valued him. And for the first time since he was a poor boy living amid the instability of Central Africa, Shabani felt the future was opening up before his eyes in the most beautiful way. He no longer looked forward with anxiety. He began to look forward with anticipation. Dreams grew bigger. Goals grew higher. He believed that the best years were still ahead. He believed he was entering the most glorious phase of his career. He believed that fate had finally chosen to stand on his side. But sometimes life is cruelest when people feel the happiest. When Shabani was playing the best football of his life, when all of Europe began to mention his name with respect, when the biggest doors were opening, a silent danger was also appearing inside his body. At first, it was just small pains, signals that no one thought would change everything. But very soon after, they would become the biggest nightmare Shabani Nonda had ever faced. But it was precisely at the moment when Shabani Nonda felt that life had finally stood on his side that fate prepared to deliver the cruelest blow. Not an opponent on the field, not a coach who lost faith, not a technical mistake. The enemy this time lay right inside his body. At first it appeared very quietly. It was only small pains in the knee after intense matches. That was not too unusual for a striker who constantly collided and had to play at high intensity. Shabani tried to ignore it. He told himself that it was just normal fatigue, that a few days of rest would make everything better. But the pains did not disappear. They returned, then appeared more frequently. There were mornings when he woke up and felt his knee unusually heavy. There were training sessions where even a simple turn made him grimace. Nevertheless, Shabani continued to play. He was at the peak of his career. Monaco needed him. The fans needed him. And he himself did not want to believe that something serious was happening. But the human body cannot be fooled forever. One day, after a match, the pain became so severe that he could no longer pretend that everything was still okay. The doctors required more in-depth examinations. At first, Shabani still had hope. He thought it was just an injury that needed a few weeks of treatment. But when he saw the serious expressions on the medical team's faces, he began to sense what he did not want to face. The first results were already worrying. The following results were even worse. Each time he stepped into the clinic, he heard another new piece of bad news. The doctors talked about serious damage in the knee. They talked about a recovery time longer than expected. They talked about risks that no one could guarantee. And then came the moment that made his heart seem to stop beating. A doctor frankly admitted that no one knew whether he could return to his previous version or not. That was the first time Shabani truly felt fear, not the fear of failure, not the fear of being criticized, but the fear of losing the life he had spent decades building. The days after that were like a prolonged nightmare. Surgeries followed one after another. Hospitals replaced stadiums. The sounds of machines replaced the cheers of the audience. Doctors replaced teammates in the locker room. The life he once knew suddenly disappeared. Each surgery carried the hope that this would be the turning point to help him return. But after each one, he had to face months of recovery. The physical therapy exercises stretched endlessly. The pains made even normal walking become a challenge. There were days when Shabani felt his body no longer belonged to him. The man who once ran faster than Europe's top defenders now had to relearn the most basic movements. The person who once made the entire stadium explode with a burst of speed now had to spend hours just to regain flexibility in his knee. That was the humiliation that few athletes could describe in words. But the most painful thing was not in the operating room. It was in the weekend days when Monaco continued to play while he could only sit and watch. From the stands, from the treatment room, or from in front of the television screen. Every time the starting whistle sounded, his heart ached. He watched his teammates running on the field. He watched big matches taking place. He watched goals being scored. He watched the moments when he should have been there. And for the first time in his life, He felt completely helpless. Since childhood, Shabani had always believed that if he worked hard enough, he could overcome any obstacle. But now, hard work was no longer enough. Willpower could not heal a damaged knee. Desire could not shorten the recovery time. He was fighting something he could not control. The physical pain also became an unwanted companion. It was present every day, every step, every recovery session. There were nights when he could not sleep because his knee throbbed. There were mornings when he woke up and the first thing he felt was not sunlight but the pain in his body. The cruelest thing was that the pain constantly reminded him of what he had lost. Each day that passed, Shabani tried to believe that he would return. But as time went on, that belief became more fragile. He began to see younger players rising up, other strikers taking the positions he once held. Football does not wait for anyone. Even the biggest stars can be forgotten if absent for too long. And then there was a moment that Shabani would remember for the rest of his life. Not in the hospital, not on the operating table, but in a normal recovery training session. When trying to perform a movement he had done thousands of times before, he realized his body no longer responded as it used to. The knee was no longer strong. The explosiveness no longer existed. The feeling of freedom when running had disappeared. In that moment, a painful truth appeared in his mind. The future he had once imagined might never happen. The Ballon d'Ors he had once dreamed of. The even more glorious seasons. The peaks he thought he would conquer. All of it might have vanished before it could become reality. And for the first time since leaving Central Africa all those years ago, Shabani Nonda felt that fate was taking back everything it had once given him. After the first years in Nashville, full of slammed doors and skeptical looks, Keith Urban did not disappear as many had predicted, but he also did not truly win in the way the world usually defines. He returned to the stage, returned to the studio, returned to endless long tours. But what fans saw was only the tip of the iceberg. Bright lights, burning guitar sounds, the gentle smile of an artist who seemed to always have everything under control. And behind it all existed a silent battle that no camera recorded, a second life made only of pain, exhaustion, and cracks in his own body. When Keith Urban began to enter the phase of wide public recognition, few knew that his body was no longer a perfect machine of art, but a system cracking day by day. The wrist injuries from thousands of hours of guitar practice, the prolonged shoulder pains after each tour, and the endless sleepless nights made him learn to live as if pain was an inevitable part of breathing. But the cruelest thing was not in the physical body, but in the loneliness of having to hide it all. Under the stage lights, he still had to be Keith Urban, the artist always full of energy, always smiling, always making the audience believe that music is a magic that never goes out. But behind the scenes, every step was a negotiation with his own body. Every time he picked up the guitar was a time he wondered if today the pain would allow him to finish the show. There were training sessions that lasted for hours, where he could no longer distinguish between practice and therapy, when specialists had to adjust his posture while trying to keep him from collapsing from exhaustion. What few knew was that many performances were completed not with full strength, but with pure willpower, the kind of willpower born from a fear greater than pain, the fear of being forgotten if he stopped. In the music world, where the spotlight changes faster than the human heartbeat, Keith understood that with just one period of silence, he could disappear from that harsh flow forever. And so he continued to stand up, continued to step onto the stage, continued to play guitar, as if nothing was destroying him from within. But the price of that persistence was the moments when he was left alone, sitting in a hotel room in strange cities, looking at his trembling hands and wondering how much longer until his body completely betrayed him. There were days when he had to rely on painkillers to stand firm, but even the medicine only hid the tip of the storm. The root remained there, smoldering, prolonged, like a song that never ends. What made this battle even heavier was that no one was allowed to see it. In front of the public, he had to maintain the image of a perfect star, a happy husband, a symbol of stability. But the truth was, there were nights he returned in silence, not saying a word to anyone, just sitting in the dark and letting his body recover in whatever way it could. He once admitted in rare moments that the hardest thing was not the stage, but stepping down from it and realizing he still had to live with that cracking body. Those years also marked a subtle shift in his music, deeper, more painful, and more real. Each chord was no longer just technique, but a trace of what he had endured. People began to realize that behind the perfection of a performance was a person learning not to collapse right on his own stage. And even though the world still called him a star in his own heart, Keith Urban understood that he was just a person trying not to let the pain rewrite the ending of his life. It was precisely in that struggle, between light and darkness, between glory and physical limits, that he lived the years that few could understand. A life where the surface was music, but inside was a silent survival battle, where each note was not only art, but also a declaration that he was still here, still standing strong, even though his body had wanted to give up many times. When the 2003 to 2004 Champions League season entered the final stage, no one really bet on AS Monaco. They were not Real Madrid, not Manchester United, nor the giants that regularly dominated Europe. But it was precisely in that doubt that a miraculous journey began, that even those involved did not dare believe they could go so far. Monaco at that time was a collection of young, explosive individuals full of desire. And among them was a name carrying the sophistication of modern football, a player from distant Australia, carrying both the pride and the burden of a career at the threshold of redefining itself. Keith Urban. The person mentioned not in music, but in a fictional football story of dreams and human limits on the European field. Monaco's journey in the Champions League that year was like a wind that no one could grasp in time. They defeated big teams with boldness, with fearless spirit, with pure and emotional attacking football. From the group stage to the quarterfinals, then the semifinals, each match passed like a heartbeat that became increasingly urgent. And when they officially earned a ticket to the final, the entire European football world had to stop and watch. That was the moment when the dream became so real it was frightening. The Champions League final stage was not just a match. It was the pinnacle of world football, where all eyes were focused, where every mistake was magnified, and where every player had to become the most perfect version of himself. When Monaco stepped onto the field, the blazing lights of Europe shone down on them like a challenge. Either you become a legend, or you disappear in history. In the locker room before the match, there was no excessive shouting. There was only heavy silence. Everyone understood that they had gone further than anyone expected, but they also understood that this was the only moment in their lives when they could touch absolute glory. And in that moment, the player carrying silent injuries, pains that lasted and were never spoken about, sat quietly, looking at his own legs as if trying to convince them to betray their limits. He knew he was not the strongest version of himself. He had entered this match with recovery days that lasted longer than training time, with pains that appeared even when he was not playing, with a body always in a state of enduring rather than playing. But there was no room for postponed perfection in a Champions League final. Either you go out on the field or you disappear. When the match began, the stadium lights turned everything into a different world. The balls moved faster than usual, the challenges became more fierce, and every gap seemed to be swallowed by the pressure. Monaco still played football, still fought, still created moments that made viewers stand up. But somewhere the difference in class and experience began to show clearly. And in all those efforts, there was one thing more painful than failure: the feeling of not being able to contribute fully. There were moments when he received the ball in seemingly perfect space, but his legs no longer had enough explosiveness to turn the idea into action. There were accelerations, but the body reacted half a beat slower. There were passes, But the power was no longer as accurate as in the days when he was whole. Each time like that, the feeling of disappointment did not come from the opponent, but from himself. The match passed like an irreversible flow. Monaco fought until the final minutes, but the dream was gradually slipping from their hands. When the final whistle sounded, there was no loud collapse, no immediate tears. There was only silence, a silence heavier than any shouting. Looking at the Champions League trophy so close, its silver shine reflecting under the lights like a cruel joke. It was there, right in front of his eyes, as if just one more step, and he could touch it. But football is never the story of almost. In that moment, he understood something that no title could teach. There are dreams that are not only beautiful, but also painful. Painful because they are real. Painful because they were so close. Painful because he had lived in it long enough to believe he could touch it with both hands. When leaving the field, he did not look back at the trophy. He only looked down at the grass, where it had witnessed everything: effort, limits, hope, and also helplessness. And in his heart, a quiet thought appeared, not of failure, but of realization. Sometimes the greatest glory is not touching the peak, but daring to stand there even when the body no longer allows perfection. Monaco's Champions League dream that year did not end with victory. It ended with a beautiful mark, a dream that had just touched the light and was pulled back by darkness. And for him, that was the moment when football was no longer just a game, but became a memory that was both brilliant and painful to the core. After that Champions League final night, Shabani Nonda no longer looked at football in the same way. What was once a pure dream now carried a layer of memories that were both brilliant and painful. And as his career continued, he began to enter a phase that very few players could accept, living in the remainder of himself. No longer the intact version that once shook Ligue 1, he became a player who had to learn to adapt to a body that had changed forever after the injury. But the cruelest thing was not only the physical decline, but the fact that the whole world still remembered him at his peak, while he was forced to live in the present full of limits. After Monaco, his journey took him through different stops in European football, each place an effort to prolong what could not be kept. At AS Roma, he stepped into a highly competitive environment where expectations were not for players who were finding themselves again. Bright moments still appeared, goals were still scored, but they no longer carried the explosive feeling as before. Every movement came with an invisible calculation: how to make the body not react too strongly, how to make the knee not break one more time. He still played, but no longer freely. Leaving Italy, he came to England in the Blackburn Rovers shirt, where football had a completely different rhythm. There, every match was like a physical battle, and Shabani had to face the reality that his body was no longer suitable for that intensity. But he still fought, still ran, still tried to create value in every scarce minute on the field. Fans saw an experienced striker, but no one saw the mornings when he took a very long time to stand up without feeling pain. No one saw the days he walked into the locker room with a heavy mood, not because of fear of failure, but because of fear that his own body would not meet the demands of the match. Then came Galatasaray, another chapter in the journey to prolong his career. In Turkey, he was welcomed as an experienced star, a player who could make a difference in important moments. And sometimes he still managed to do that. Goals still came, technical moments still made the stands explode. But everything carried a different shade. No longer dominance, but existence. He was no longer the center of all expectations, but a person trying to hold on to the last bit of light from a once brilliant career. The hardest thing in this phase was not playing in different countries, but being constantly compared to his past self. Every time he touched the ball, people not only looked at the present, but unconsciously remembered the old version: faster, stronger, sharper. Those comparisons did not need to be spoken, but they always existed in the eyes of the fans, in the way the media mentioned his name, even in the way he himself looked at himself in the mirror. Shabani was not only playing against opponents on the field, he was playing against his own memories. There were matches where he scored and people still applauded, but inside he knew clearly that the feeling was no longer the same as before. It was no longer an affirmation that he was approaching the peak, but a reminder that that peak was left behind. And each goal at this point no longer opened up the future, but only helped prolong a past that was gradually fading. When looking back at the journey from Monaco to Roma, from England to Turkey, Shabani began to clearly feel something that no one could say directly to him. The biggest opportunities in his career might have passed, not because he was not talented enough, but because his body no longer allowed him to return to his most perfect period. Bigger clubs, bigger stages, higher titles, all gradually turned into possibilities that would never become reality. It was a kind of quiet regret, no collapse, no sudden ending. Just day after day passing, he realized that the football world had moved on without waiting for him to catch up. And while younger players began to write their own stories, Shabani lived in the final chapter of a book he once thought would be much longer. Every evening after matches, when the noise of the stadium had faded, he often sat for a very long time, not to think about failure, but to wonder what would happen if his body had not betrayed him at the most important moment. But that question never had an answer. There was only silence, and the feeling that a life he once believed was surely his now was only a fading shadow, dissolving into the memories of European football. Even though the peak years had receded far away, Shabani Nonda never chose to give up. When his body no longer allowed him to return to the strongest version of himself, he began to step into another phase of life, where value was no longer measured by the number of goals, but by the way a person continued to stand strong after everything he had lost. He still played, still trained, still appeared on the field, but each run now carried consideration, as if body and will were continuously negotiating with each other to maintain the existence of a dream that was no longer intact. What made Shabani different was not that he had once reached the peak, but the way he refused to disappear when that peak left. Throughout the rest of his career journey, he always carried an invisible responsibility. It was not only responsibility to the club or to the fans, but also responsibility to his family, those who had placed all their faith in football as the path to change their fate. Every time he stepped onto the field, he understood that behind him was not only a team, but also real-life stories that had been rewritten thanks to his success. His family had a better life, and that became a motivation that did not allow him to stop, even when his body continuously sent warning signals. In the shirt of the Congo national football team, Shabani Nonda also continued to contribute through many years of ups and downs. Even though the national team did not always achieve great achievements on the international stage, he remained one of the most important symbols of the country's football. Every time he wore the national team shirt, he did not just play as a player, but as a person carrying the pride of an entire nation. There were matches that did not bring victory, but still brought meaning, because his presence on the field had become a symbol of perseverance and hope for the younger generation. When his career gradually moved to the other side of the peak, Shabani began to find values other than football. He participated in social and humanitarian activities, especially programs related to youth and to sports in Africa. He understood better than anyone that football was not only the path that took him out of poverty, but also the path that could change the lives of children like him back then. The trips back to his homeland were no longer just times for playing matches, but also times when he met, shared, and inspired the next generation. In his talks with young players, Shabani did not talk about glory in a glamorous way. He talked about loneliness, about the days he had to leave his family, about the injuries no one saw, and about the feeling of standing on the border between success and loss. It was that authenticity that made his story stronger than any title. He was no longer just a former player, but became a living proof that humans can stand up more times than fate seems to allow. Over time, Shabani learned to redefine himself. If before he only knew himself through goals and recognition, now he began to see value in simpler things: the respect of teammates, the trust of young people, and the feeling that he could still create positive influence even though he was no longer at the peak. That was a quiet but profound transformation from a player always obsessed with having to prove himself to a person who accepted that value did not only lie in the stage lights. Nevertheless, inside Shabani there still existed a part that would never completely disappear. That was the memory of the peak days, of Monaco, of the goals that made all of Europe take notice. Those memories were no longer pressure, but became part of the journey. He did not run away from them, but he also no longer let them define his entire self. Instead, he accepted that life is not only written by great moments, but also by the way a person faces the end of those moments. And in that acceptance, Shabani Nonda found a different form of victory. Not victory on the field, but victory over his own collapse. A victory without trophies, without spotlight, but enough to help him continue walking, even though the road ahead no longer resembled what he once dreamed of. Behind the image of a man who once stood on the biggest stages of European football, there was a world that very few people had ever seen. That was the world of long, sleepless nights, where Shabani Nonda lay still in the darkness and listened to his own body, speaking through dull pains that never completely disappeared. There were nights when his knee hurt so much that even a small movement made his whole body contract. There were other nights when the pain was no longer physical, but became something heavier, harder to name, as if everything he had ever lost was returning at the same time to remind him that not all dreams last forever. When the stadium lights went out, when the cheers of tens of thousands no longer rang in his ears, Shabani returned to a completely different silence. It was not peace, but emptiness. In that emptiness, he began to feel more clearly than ever the loneliness that peak football always hid. On the field, he was once the center of all eyes, the person who was expected, cheered, and trusted. But after all the matches, all the trips, he often ended up alone, facing himself in long periods when no one truly understood what he was going through. The hardest thing was not the injury. It was also not having to adapt to the decline of his body. The hardest thing was having to always appear stable, while inside he was gradually cracking. In front of the public, Shabani Nonda still had to be the image of a strong player, a man who never gave up, a symbol of determination. But behind those compliments was an invisible pressure, forcing him to hide the truth that there were days when he was not sure if he could continue or not. There were moments when he wondered if without the injury, where his life would have gone. Whether he could have become one of the greatest strikers in Europe, not just in one season, but for many consecutive years. Whether he could have stood on bigger stages, won more titles, and written a more complete story for his career. But those questions never had answers. They only existed like fragments of a future that never happened, quietly passing through his mind every time night fell. For many years, Shabani lived in two parallel lives that not everyone realized. One life was the image the world saw: goals, celebrations, moments standing under stadium lights. The other life was the recovery days, the prolonged pains, the sleepless nights, and the silent dialogues with himself about the limits of his body and fate. Those two lives never completely separated, but always existed at the same time, overlapping each other, creating a complex reality that only he had to carry. There were days when Shabani felt he was living in an unexplainable contradiction. One part of him still wanted to fight, still wanted to prove that he was not finished. But another part understood very clearly that his body was no longer as it used to be. That inner struggle was not loud, not dramatic, but it eroded his spirit little by little, like water flowing through stone, not breaking it immediately, but constantly changing its inner shape. Even in moments considered successful, when he still scored goals, still participated, still got mentioned in the lineup, there still existed an unfilled sense of lack. It was not the lack of titles or glory, but the lack of the perfect version he once had. Every time he stepped onto the field, He was aware that he was playing with a body that was no longer whole, and that made every victory more complex, no longer simple pure joy. Those mental wounds never appeared on sports news. No one wrote about the nights he lay silent in the hotel. No one recorded the moments when he had to calm himself after each time his body reacted incorrectly, and no one saw the thoughts he was forced to keep to himself. But it was precisely those unseen things that were the deepest part in Shabani Nonda's life, the part that shaped the person he was beyond the spotlight of the field. And perhaps the most tragic thing was not that he had lost his best version, but that he still had to continue living in the memory of that version every day, like a never-ending reminder of what could have happened, but ultimately never became reality. Now, when Shabani Nonda has left the top fields of Europe, his life flows in a completely different rhythm. There are no more starting whistles, no more blinding lights of big stadiums, no more cross-country flights or weeks living under match pressure. Instead, there is the quiet, sometimes heavy, of a man who has gone through all the peaks and valleys of professional football. He lives a slower, lighter life, but never completely escapes the memories that shaped who he is. In the present days, Shabani spends a lot of time with his family, with community activities, and with reflecting on the journey he has been through. When looking back, he no longer sees football as a simple chain of successes or failures. He sees it as a second life that was given to him, a life that took him from the poor streets of Central Africa to the most prestigious stadiums in Europe. From a boy running barefoot on dusty red patches of land, he had become one of the most notable strikers in Ligue 1, a person who once made defensive lines wary, once had his name called in the biggest stands. But along with what football brought, there also existed what football took away. It brought him fame, money, recognition, and the opportunity to change his entire family's life. But it also took away the wholeness of his body, took away the years when he could have reached the peak longer, and took away the most perfect version of himself right at the moment he thought he was about to touch it. That was the truth that Shabani never avoided, but also never let it turn into pure regret. In his journey, he left a deep mark at AS Monaco, where he was once the symbol of an inspiring attacking generation, contributing to one of the club's memorable periods in Europe. At Monaco, fans still remember him as a striker, capable of deciding matches with just one moment. With the Congo national football team, he became one of the representative faces of the country's football, carrying the pride of an entire nation every time he stepped onto the field. And more broadly, he became a symbol for the generation of African players who dared to step out into the world, dared to face prejudice, and dared to affirm their value in the harshest competitions. But what makes Shabani Nonda's story special does not only lie in the statistics or titles. It lies in the contrast between what he achieved and what he could have become. The most painful truth in his journey was that the most excellent version, the fastest, strongest, and most dangerous version of Shabani Nonda had been taken away by injury right when he reached the threshold of absolute greatness. It was not a collapse, but an interruption of a potential that had not yet been completed. A story left unfinished right at the point where it seemed it would become the greatest. But if it stopped there, the story would not fully reflect who he is, because beside that regret is another truth, deeper and more enduring. Even though his body was damaged, even though his career was interrupted, Shabani Nonda was never defeated in spirit. He did not let the injury define his entire life. He did not disappear in failure, nor did he live forever in the past. Instead, he continued to stand up, continued to play when he could, continued to contribute to football and to the community, and continued to become a role model for young people walking the same path he once did. That resilience is the true legacy of Shabani Nonda. Not just the goals, not just the titles, but the way he faced the loss of what was most important while still not losing himself. He proved that a person does not need to be perfect to become great. Sometimes, greatness lies in continuing to live with what remains, continuing to carry the wounds, but not letting them become the final limit. Today, when looking back at the entire journey, people do not just see a former football player. People see a story about a human being, about sacrifice, about desire, about sloth, and about the ability to stand firm in the face of things that cannot be changed. And perhaps that is why Shabani Nonda's story does not only belong to football, but also to all those who have ever had to trade to pursue a dream bigger than themselves. Because in the final truth about him, there is one thing that never changes. No matter how much fate takes away, Shabani Nonda has never lost himself. The story of Shabani Nonda is not only the journey of a football player, but also an epic about the trade-off between glory and loss. From the boy born in Burundi, growing up amid poverty and political instability, he rose to the peak of Ligue 1 with AS Monaco, becoming the top scorer and the pride of Congolese football. But behind the brilliant goals was a painful truth. His body betrayed him right when he was closest to the biggest dream of his life. The knee injuries, the consecutive surgeries, and the feeling of helplessness when watching his teammates continue to play had turned glory into a memory that was both beautiful and bitter. What makes this story especially heartbreaking does not lie in the titles or the number of goals, but in the best version of a person that was taken away too soon. When he wore the Congo national football team shirt, he did not just represent a team, but represented an entire generation of African players with the desire to change their fate. But football, like life, is not always fair. It gave him the light of the Champions League stage, but also took away the ability for him to become the greatest version of himself. From the perspective of American people, Nonda's story is a powerful reminder that success is never measured only by titles or money. It is also measured by what people have to sacrifice in silence. And more importantly, the greatest lesson is, the body can limit you, but willpower and dignity are what determine who you are after all the lights have gone out. Shabani Nonda is not just a former player. He is proof that even when a dream is left unfinished, the value of a person can still be complete. If you feel that Shabani Nonda's story touches your heart, please hit subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying the journeys full of loss, determination, and glory behind the stadium lights. Thank you for watching until the end of the video, and see you again in the next story, where we will continue to explore the lives where football is only the tip of a tragedy and a much bigger dream.